Gators Breakdown episode 107 is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me tonight is former Florida Gators wide receiver and SEC network analyst, Chris Doering. Chris, thanks for joining me again here on Gators Breakdown.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I appreciate you having me back, man.
Yeah, have a fun time. The last time we talked to you right after the spring game, and of course, a lot has happened since then. Season has started, and midway through the season, and we'll see if these Gators can rebound and get a big victory against these Bulldogs.
It's a tough task for sure. I mean, obviously, this is a rivalry that Florida's owned for the last 20 or 30 years now, but this is probably one of the better, if not the best, Georgia team that Florida will face. So they got their work cut out for them for sure.
Absolutely. And before we dive in here, remember, you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Just search on those sites or get the links by following Gators Breakdown on Twitter and on Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Chris, we'll get a little personal for a second. You got the uniqueness of this rivalry by playing home and home in 93 and 94 when you got to go between the hedges and play in the swamp, something we don't get to see anymore. How different was that in what you got to experience from the home and home to Jacksonville?
Yeah. Well, I'm one of the few players that had a chance to play in Jacksonville, in Gainesville, and in Athens. And while I grew up loving this rivalry, and more so was tormented by this rivalry because of the Georgia's dominance when I was a kid. I tell a story an awful lot about the pass I caught against Alabama in the '94 SEC championship game in Atlanta. After the game, was rushed by a bunch of people to interview me, and the first one introduces himself, said, "Hey, I'm Buck Bellew," and I said, "Man, I hated you when I was a kid." So that's my history was similar to what Coach Spurrier's was, and why Coach Spurrier's emphasis was winning that game against Georgia. It was his experience not doing well against them. As a kid, I watched those Florida teams during the '80s really struggle, and so to be on the other side of it was a pleasure to kind of turn the tide. And I think having had the opportunity to play in Jacksonville, I love it in Jacksonville. I think it should remain in Jacksonville. I'm a big fan of the uniqueness of that and having that as a special game. I did like having the experience of getting them to come to Gainesville and getting to go between the hedges and the fact that we hung 52 on them there and beat them the most that it ever at that point. Still maybe and at this point, the most that's ever been laid on them in a loss at home was something to be special to be a part of. And I got a couple clippings of the hedges, man. I still have the hedges with me, so nice. Kind of a nice little souvenir from that day in Athens.
Was Spurrier different that week leading up to that game?
He was always a little different leading up to the Georgia game, and you could tell that it meant a little bit more to him. And he laid it out for us. When early in his career there. If we were to achieve what we wanted to achieve, it started with beating Georgia. Georgia's been the biggest thorn in Florida's side for a long time, and a lot of the newer Gator fans, they don't understand that relationship with Georgia because of the dominance that we've had for a long period of time now. But back in the day, it was always Georgia that seemed to kind of knock us out, and even when we had them down, they'd find a way to win. With that Buck Bellew to Lindsey Scott play. So. I always sensed a little more intensity from him. If you're going to win an SEC title, it started with beating Georgia. You got to win the SEC East. They're in our division. You got to win those head-to-heads within your division. And so there's a lot of motivation, and certainly we sensed that from Coach Spurrier during the week of leading up to that game.
And Chris, personally for me, it's my biggest game too. I was a Gator raised in Southeast Georgia, so it's all my best friends are Georgia fans. So it's leading up to this game. It's a lot of fun and all that, and it's just a little personal for me too, just because we get the little going back and forth all week.
Yeah, I think a lot of the newer fans would point to Florida State. Some of them point to Tennessee, but that rivalry with Georgia is certainly special. I mean, anytime you got a Hall of Fame devoted to one game, that means it's a little different than everybody else.
Which you are a part of, by the way.
I am a part of that, and I actually have the bust here behind me. Something doesn't really look a ton like me, but I'm honored to. That's my first and only boss that I've ever had. So I'll take it regardless of how different it looks from me, I think.
Absolutely. Chris, Florida's coming off the bye week now. What are some things you would say this team needs to work on as they try and get by with the limitations at quarterback?
How much time we got here, man? I mean, it's a team that's flawed in a lot of ways. And first, let me say that I am very impressed with what Coach McElwain's done in suspending those guys at the beginning of the season, the impact that that's had on this team. It's the right thing to do, but it's left Florida shorthanded. And I think, Coach Chiswick on our show made a comment a couple of weeks ago that playing down these 9 guys is like being on probation, and it's like playing without some scholarships, and it's affected Florida, not only with Callaway and Scarlett, your 2 big offensive weapons that you lost, but from a depth perspective. The depth on defense, you can see Florida wearing down. You see them miss more tackles in the second half of games. Those guys would have provided some additional rotational snaps. I think you also see it on special teams, and your starters are the ones that play special teams, or your non-starters are the ones that play special teams. And Florida has been miserable in special teams this year as well. And I think it's really impacted those 2 phases more, maybe so than what people would even realize. So I think continuing to develop some young guys, finding folks that you can trust to develop depth and provide some much needed snaps is important. And during the bye week, you can get a chance to go back and work on the basics. You can work on your fundamentals. You can give some new guys some opportunities to get more snaps. So I'm sure they did some of that. It's also an opportunity to really dive into putting a game plan together that with some stuff that maybe Georgia hadn't seen before. I think back a couple years ago, Florida decided they were just going to come out and run the ball just about every single down, impose their will all day long on the Bulldogs, and somehow found a way to win. So I'm sure the coaches have been dissecting a ton of tape over the last couple of weeks and figuring out where some of the weaknesses are of this team. But my hopes would be that Felipe Franks is continuing to evolve during the bye week. We know that this offense is limited because of his inexperience and some of the things that he doesn't do well. But I think this is an opportunity now. You get potentially, from what I'm hearing, you get Tyree Cleveland back, you get Kadarius Toney back, you got some offensive weapons. And the biggest thing that I think that the quarterback needs to do is one, get the guys to the line of scrimmage, some comfort level with getting them to the line, going with the play. And I think that's where the coaching staff has really narrowed things down. It's like, hey, we're not going to ask you to make a bunch of checks. We're not going to make a bunch of reads. We're going to call a play. You get to the line of scrimmage, you get lined up, and let's go. Let's develop some tempo, some rhythm. And part of rhythm is converting on third down. So Florida needs to be successful on first and second down, get in a third and manageable situation, and create some rhythm where you can get into the flow a little bit better than they have over the last couple games.
Chris, you mentioned suspensions and, of course, the injuries to Tyree Cleveland, Luke Del Rio. It is year 3 under Jim McElwain. Should we still see a little more success than what we've seen this year on offense, even with the suspensions and the injuries?
Well, I would like to see more improvement, but let's look at it. I mean, I really think it's difficult to judge given the suspensions and the way that affected the team both on the field and, maybe mentally when you lose those guys like you did so close to the season. I think secondly, the injuries, particularly Luke Del Rio. And I think I've told you guys before how I feel about Luke Del Rio. I think he's the best fit for this job. I think he should have been starting week 1 against Michigan. The offense, you could see a different pace, a different feel to it when he got in there against Kentucky, and it was disappointing that he went down with that injury against Vanderbilt because I really think the team was ready to hit their stride. This team needs a guy that can distribute to the playmakers because there are some playmakers around the quarterback position that maybe they've been lacking before. But at the end of the day, this is a bottom line business, and I know that Coach McElwain's not going to make excuses for the fact that they've been less than as successful as they'd like to be. But I do think there has to be some of this taken with a grain of salt, understanding the circumstances, understanding you're having to play with a redshirt freshman quarterback that's really young to playing football in general. I mean, this was a guy that didn't play. He played baseball a lot of his life, didn't play a lot of football. So I think it's one of those things you got to kind of suck it up and again try to play the hand that was dealt to you. But I do think it's difficult to really get a good feel for the true progression of the program in year 3.
Got you there. So, Chris, we know what this offense is kind of built on and what it needs to be built on probably moving forward is the running game led by true freshman Malik Davis, and kind of what a surprise he's been, and probably one of the best true freshmen that Florida's rolled out at running back in quite some time. Kind of looking at the season going forward and through the bye week, I was like, maybe kind of use Georgia as a blueprint a little bit, but, be about a 70-30 run team. But I'm just not sure Georgia's the team to figure that out against.
Yeah, I'd love to see Florida run the ball a little bit more, particularly given the ball to Malik Davis. I agree with you completely. This guy, he reminds me a lot, and I've said it multiple times on our show, he reminds me a lot of John Kelly from Tennessee. And I was really impressed with the way Kelly played against Florida a couple weeks back. The physicality that he has for a guy that's his stature, the way he finishes runs. I think he's incredible. And I like what I've seen from Malik Davis to this point in time too, because he's a smaller guy, but he sees the hole really well. He hits the hole hard, and he finishes falling forward. Very rarely do you see him get knocked back. And it almost makes you wonder, why couldn't Mark Thompson, who has the body, who has the size, why can't he run that same way, with that same physicality, the same way of finishing those runs? So I do think that the offensive line has kind of taken that challenge on their shoulders. I love the way that they ran the football against Kentucky. I think they need to do that a little bit more. But at the same time, it's difficult to do that against this Georgia football team, as you mentioned. This team is very well developed at all 3 levels. The defensive line is very, very stout. They do a great job of keeping the offensive linemen off their linebackers, particularly Roquan Smith there in the middle. I love the way that Bellamy and Carter set the edges. And then again, the secondary is good enough to play a ton of man coverage and get an extra guy down there to run support if they need to. And let's be honest, Florida has not played well against cover 1. Single high safety man coverage on the outside. They've just not done a good job of creating separation. They struggled against Michigan. They struggled against LSU. Teams have seen the blueprint, and until you're able to win on the outside, it's going to be tough to run the football because everybody can get an extra guy down there in the box to run support.
And we mentioned he may be coming back this week, and he was practicing today. But Tyree Cleveland, so you're talking about beating Georgia on the outside. And we saw Missouri have some success against this Georgia defense, but I don't think we'd call Felipe Franks,
Jake Fromm.
Jake Fromm and Drew Lock out of Missouri being able to test this Georgia secondary. So with Tyree Cleveland coming back, can it open up something just a little bit more for Felipe Franks in this passing game?
Well, you'd like to think so. I mean, the problem, again, there's a lot of blame to go around, and I think Tyree Cleveland does a great job of taking the top off, but still, I want to see guys that can win on the intermediate routes too. Mm-hmm. It's tough. Not only does Felipe struggle with reading the coverage and knowing where to go with the ball, but in a lot of cases he's looking and guys are blanketed. And, I definitely think you got to be able to stretch coverage, and a guy like Tyree Cleveland has shown that he can do that. But at the same time, you have to have guys that are able to play physically on the outside that can create when you run the curls, when you run and let's be honest, I'd like to see a better job of play calling with man beaters. I want to see more slants. I want to see more crossers. Right. Do a good job of using some rub route opportunities, some in-breaking routes. Those are things that allow you to get a little more separation versus that man coverage. But Tyree, we know he's a big play guy. And having him back would be a huge lift to this offense for sure.
Let's move to the other side of the ball for a sec, Chris. As far as defense is getting better and better as the year goes on, and the run defense really is getting pretty good, just holding Texas A&M just to over 80 yards rushing. But their toughest test yet with a running back duo, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel.
Let's not forget about DeAndre Swift or Holyfield or Harriet. I mean, they got 5 guys that they can plug in there. And the reason they're having so much success running the football this year is the drastic improvement that offensive line has made from last year to this year. They were the Achilles heel last year, not only in run blocking, but in pass protection. And what a great luxury it is when you're playing a true freshman quarterback like Jake Fromm, and you can hand the ball off as many times as they do. when you're not under duress from the opposing pass rush. So it's going to be a difficult challenge for Florida's defense. They still continue to miss too many tackles. I'm really worried about not having Jordan Sherritt in there. I think Jordan Sherritt, to me, has been the unsung hero of the Florida defense in the first half of the season. His play up front, his physicality. I mean, I've watched him in that Vanderbilt game. I think the first series of the game, he drove on three successive plays, drove the guy in front of him, trying to block him right back into the quarterback's face, and really was able to affect the quarterback. So I think you miss him from a play standpoint, from a leadership standpoint. But it is a defense that is getting better. The problem that I have with this defense, particularly at the linebacker spot, is they don't play very well in space when it comes to covering the pass. I don't think they have an understanding of where their zones are. Finding guys within those zones and playing a lot of cross. Florida's been killed on a lot of play action pass with those over routes, just not identifying those crossers coming in behind them. So all of that comes with experience. I think we all knew that they were going to struggle a little bit from when they lose 8 starters, or with Marcel Harris not in there too. I mean, it's a significant amount of guys that were talented players for this defense that you had to find a way to fill the shoes. And it takes time. It takes some reps. But I like Randy Shannon an awful lot. I think he's a guy that is an incredible teacher. And I hope that the learning curve is starting to shorten a little bit for this team.
All right, Chris, just a couple more for you, and we'll get you out of here on Gators Breakdown. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah.
So, Jacob Fromm came in after Easton got hurt. Have you seen enough from him that if Florida stops the Georgia run game, as we just talked about, it's going to be very difficult? Can he be a quarterback that will lead Georgia to victory if they have to rely on his arm more than they have in the first half of the season?
Yeah, and you've seen his capacity expanding from week to week. I mean, I think he threw the ball in their last game against Missouri. I think he threw the ball 32, 36 times, something like that. So they're trusting him a little bit more. He's being developed. I think he's becoming more confident. But I think he has that it factor, that leadership that the rest of the team looks to. Clearly, they haven't made a move back to Jacob Eason, even though he's healthy, because they feel like they got something here in Jake Fromm. I think, the best way to try to beat this team, every defensive coordinator will tell you the same thing, regardless of who they're playing. Our first goal is to stop the run. All right, so you take away the run. And I don't know that you can stop it against this Georgia team, but you can minimize some of the big plays and hopefully, get some helmets on the ball carrier. But at the end of the day, you want to take your chances with a true freshman trying to beat you. I don't think Georgia's receivers are all that great. I love Isaac Nauta. I love their tight ends as a whole. But the outside receivers are somewhat limited and inexperienced to some degree. So I think that's, if you got to pick your poison, I'll take Jake Fromm trying to beat me throwing the football all day long.
Absolutely. And Chris, Kirby has his team rolling in year 2, and of course all the Georgia fans and kind of fans around the nation just now wondering, can he beat Florida? And it was contributed to the turnaround from Rick to Kirby, where it just kind of looks a little more aggressive. They're taking on his mentality, and do you sense pressure for him to win this game?
Well, I've said it for the last couple of weeks. When I watch this Georgia team, they play very, very even keeled. They don't play up. They don't play down. Going to Notre Dame, getting that win there, I thought when they came back home, they may have a letdown, but I believe that was Mississippi State the next week.
Right.
Really were able to play at a high level in that game. You haven't seen a significant drop-off. The worst blip on the radar to me was that first half against Missouri. They gave up some deep balls. They blew some coverages, some very un-Georgia-like things from this defense that we've seen this year. But what they do, they bounce back in the second half. They refocus and played at a much higher level. I think that's the biggest impact where I've seen Kirby Smart on this team from year 1 to year 2. He's changed the culture, in my opinion. This was a Georgia team that has underachieved for a long period of time, and now he has them believing. He has them playing at a high level with great focus. And it does. I mean, it looks an awful lot like Alabama, as it was supposed to. That was the design by hiring Kirby Smart. What a great situation. You get a guy that played at Georgia, who coached under, was an integral part of that building that Georgia or that Alabama defense, and the guy recruits like a devil, man. I mean, I've never seen a guy be able to recruit as well as he does. So he's got everything, in my opinion. He's got the credibility from playing at that school, playing defense at Georgia. He's got the rings with Alabama. He's got them now in a scheme with veteran guys that are juniors and seniors primarily on the defense that are playing with a lot of confidence. And, the way that they've played even keel throughout the season to me indicates that there's been a turning of the tide there in that program, in my opinion.
Absolutely agree there. So, Chris, before I let you go, a couple of days ago, you tweeted out where you guys you and the SEC Network did some ranking of the SEC coaches, and a little bit of surprise for some Gator fans there where, of course, number 1, Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, number 2, Dan Mullen, 3, Will Muschamp, number 4, and Jim McElwain, 5. Who all went into that, if you could share? And was those 5? Was that your ranking?
That's my personal ranking. And we do after the show on Saturdays. Typically, Dari Noka, Gene Chizik, our producer, Brad Buchanan, and a couple other folks. We'll rank our 14 teams top to bottom in the conference. And, it's a weird year. If we talk about it, I think we all agree 1 and 2 are pretty simple. But then you get after that, it's a hodgepodge of teams that are kind of lumped in there. And then you get down to about 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And some pretty bad teams at the bottom. So that's been fun to do. But we expanded it to another topic this week, and that was our ranking of our top 5 coaches. I think there was a lot of similarities between all of us. The big difference maybe in some is Malzahn being in that top 5. Over McElwain from some of them. I think we all agree that Dan Mullen's done probably more with less at Mississippi State than the rest of the folks. I mean, they typically recruit 5-star guys that Georgia and Florida and Alabama have the luxury of recruiting. But Muschamp to me, and I'm a big Muschamp believer. And if you remember when Jeremy Foley made the press conference about letting him go, he said that's a good football coach we're having to let go. And a lot of it is, I just came back from speaking up in Knoxville at the quarterback club this week, through some tough times in Knoxville, as we all know. And the thing that they're struggling with was the thing that Florida was struggling with when Muschamp was here, is the negativity. The negativity becomes so loud, becomes so overwhelming that it's impossible to succeed. And you can see that with Tennessee. And I think that's what happened to Will here. I firmly believe that 2 things. 1, if he had a little bit more time, that he would have figured it all out. And 2, if he hadn't hired Charlie Weiss as his offensive coordinator in year number 1, that it would have been a totally different story. I mean, I would have loved to have seen Kurt Roper be the offensive coordinator from day 1, because it would have been a totally different offense. And I think there would have been a better chance that he would have succeeded here. But things happen for a reason. He's found himself at South Carolina. If you look at the job that he's done this year with all the injuries that they've had, their defense gives up a ton of yards, but they play really opportunistically in the red zone. They're extremely tough. They take away their turnover margin, or their takeaway margin is considerably high in the SEC. So he just has his team believing. And let's not forget that decision he made last year in the middle of the year to yank the red shirt off and take Bentley. That was huge, and something that was very criticized by a lot of folks. But it turned out to be the right move. It helped push the program forward. So I do think a lot of Will, and I have him high. And there's no disrespect to what Jim McElwain's done at Florida this year. Whether you take those other suspensions and everything into consideration or not, I think some of the star may have lost a little luster so far this season for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with that. After Muschamp got fired, I was like, yeah, he'll go on to have some success. And as soon as South Carolina hired him, I was like, that's a pretty good hire. I thought I did think that he could be a good coach. It just wasn't working out at Florida for a multitude of reasons. But it just wasn't happening. And I agree there. I think he'll be at South Carolina for a while.
Yep, no doubt. They seem to appreciate him there, and South Carolina has a little different expectation level than what Florida does for where their program should be every year. And that's not to say that they've been to an SEC championship game before, but at the same time, I think they have a little more realistic expectation on what it's going to take the time period to rebuild the program there versus maybe what the Florida fans do.
Absolutely. Chris, I can't thank you again for joining us here on Gators Breakdown again. Everybody can catch you this weekend on the SEC Network, and I'm sure you guys have plenty to talk about with all these games, and we'll be breaking down Florida, Georgia as well.
Yeah, we'll be on Friday night with our preview show, and then all day during our triple header on Saturday with the wrap-up show at the end. So it's a long day, but one that I certainly look forward to and enjoy, and appreciate you having me on again, man.
Sounds good. And remember, I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. So for Chris, I'm Dave. Thanks for listening to Gators Breakdown.